In this short video, I would like to shift your perspective on bias in AI from framing it from the terms of eradication to rather exploring the issue of bias as a matter of continuous reflection and mitigation strategies. And discussing this issue is actually really important because I think to date, any discussion on AI in society has been almost synonymous to the discussion of the constant harmful presence of bias in it that actually hampers its effectiveness and its societal acceptance for people for whom it's supposed to yield continuous benefits. Now, let's go back to the root of the problem. What is bias? If we look at the dictionary definition of bias, it always has this some kind of negative connotation, literally as this negative prejudice or negative inclination against a certain person or group of people, especially in a way that lends it this unfair idea, right? And bias is actually a quite important mechanism for us as all human beings that's very difficult to avoid. And some of the benefits of bias are that it actually acts as a mental shortcut to help us construct an understanding of the world, to help us construct certain meaning and making sense of information that constantly flows to our attention. Because we have that mental shortcut, we're easier able to determine what's important and what not, to sort the incoming information. It allows us to act quickly on the new insights and prevent from this overload of constant information. Basically, bias as cognitive memory can act as this muscle that helps us to perceive information in the world. Now, that's for the positive side of bias. But why it has received a more negative and kind of this connotation with something unfair is because it has a lot of drawbacks. Because if we constantly keep relying only on this muscle memory, the cognitive shortcuts of bias, we actually don't bother of having a larger picture because we always rely on what we already know. And it gives us an illusion that we know the whole picture when actually we keep relying only on one snippet on it without reviewing whether that information still holds true. It does allow us to have quick decisions, but these decisions, because of this reliance, can be seriously flawed. And our memory has a tendency to reinforce things that we know and hence perhaps perpetuate certain errors and injustices without constantly reflecting on what that bias means and where it came from. Technologically speaking, bias has been very often framed as deficiency and imbalance, but not in technology, in the humans that help to put that bias to use in the technological systems that they produce. It is because of the flaws in human perception that technological systems may be flawed because they're perceived as only neutral as that technological component. Algorithms, in contrast to human beings, are perceived as these harbors of objectivity. And there's this very popular phrase that perhaps many of you have already heard, that bias in AI is often synonymous with the phrase garbage in, garbage out, meaning that AI merely reproduce the human flaws and human misconceptions that are then reproduced through the training of the algorithms and their operational use in the society. So if we look at bias from this very narrow and sort of technical perception, and specifically that it originates and perpetuates only in humans, then the goal is to how to spot it in time and to eradicate bias from all the AI and AI-infused robotic applications. However, this definition lends itself quite questionable if we consider that technology such as AI can probably never be really neutral and only objective, that it always does something sort of more than it was designed to do. And we even are wondering at the scope of the problem of eradicating bias, like, is it ever possible to identify and remove all of the bias? So I would suggest to look at that issue more broader and try to understand it from a perspective of AI as a dynamic socio-technical systems that we've already introduced you to. According to this approach, AI is never just its technical or, let's say, supposedly objective component, but it always is, and it operates within the combination of the social, the human actors that power it and that use it, the technological component, within specific world environments of the cultural, institutional, regulatory expectations, but also certain norms and traditions that people are born into and also cannot escape. And according to that definition, it is never just about the technological component, because all of the components of AI system continuously interact and co-shape each other through this interaction. And bias can come in, not just at the technological or the human, but at every of these components. And it also can co-produce each other when these three components interact. Now, let's look at a certain example that I've selected for you, specifically some forms of applying AI in the city. We may seem, that we're only just, AI is something that exists in the social networks or elsewhere, autonomous weapon systems. But already now, AI is quite often powering some city interaction and some systems and infrastructures in the city that are actually invisible to human eyes. So we may not be aware that we're living in an environment that is already quite a lot penetrated by AI systems. For instance, in the Netherlands, the country where I live and work, AI has been deployed to understand the perception of safety in the city. Safety is a very charged social value that a lot of people really rely on when determining, for instance, where they want to buy a certain house, where they want to send their children to school, where they see themselves living for longer term in the country. And so based on the level of perception of safety in the city that is determined by many factors, for instance, the occurrence of crimes or burglaries or whatnot, there's been this selection of maps in the country that render some regions in the country, some regions in the city as safe, as less safe, as not safe, or a more pro-dynamic to unsafe changes. And quite often when you talk to the police officers and try to understand how the level of safety in a certain region in the city is determined, AI is already powering that perception for the police officers itself. For instance, by building on the models of past occurrences of burglaries or certain safety-prone incidents in the area, and building past historic dependency strands of which areas are likely to have more incidents than others. And what often happens is these so-called self-fulfilling prophecies. When certain areas in the city are labeled as unsafe, police officers tend to dispatch more forces in them to patrol areas, to control people, and to look for these unsafe incidents that are likely to happen. And as we often know, if you look for something, you're very likely to find it. So it's not to say that this is the only criteria that goes into labeling certain areas in the city as safe and unsafe, but it certainly does have an element of creating a perception of what goes in those considerations and how difficult it might be to escape the idea or the label of an unsafe zone in the city, or to account for the dynamic situation when the area is gradually starting to transform from an unsafe to a safe neighborhood. But people, meanwhile, are really making real choices and decisions on how to allocate housing and how to select certain educational options for their children in schools. So the way we're perceiving safety, but also coincidentally fair treatment of certain regions in the city, is also being indirectly co-shaped by the deployment of AI systems that may be biased to some factors rather than others. Now, to expand upon the technical definition of bias that I've introduced above, I would like to offer a philosophical lens that I think makes it more complex and nuanced with regard to AI as a socio-technical system. Now, according to philosophical definitions, bias is an ontological condition. Ontological means that is something essential to what it means to be human, something we cannot remove because each and all of us have that. Bias is an element and a mechanism that helps us always to see something as something, that cognitive mechanism that we talked about in the beginning. Bias on this matter never had originally a negative meaning. It was like a prior stage to making meaning, prior judgment, prejudgment, prior decisions, choices, and awareness that help to orient us in the world and to reflect further on those choices. Never stay at that prejudgment, prior decision stage. And on that account, we can never avoid bias. It's just an essential feature of what it means to be human. For instance, in AI development, coupling that definition would mean that bias comes along way before the data collection stage, this famous garbage in, garbage out scenario. It comes already at the stage of who gets to frame the problem and how the problem is defined. What are the criteria for facilitating a certain AI development? How the data is being collected, and what criteria for selecting and preparing the data are deployed. Because of all of that complexity, it may mean that we just don't have anything to do. We're irresponsible for these conditions of bias in our lives because, we cannot escape it anyway. But actually, it means something to the contrary. I suggest that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aware of bias, but we have that much more responsibility to discern constantly and proactively bias in our lives and find ways how to mitigate it when it leads to potential harmful effects. And for that, we have quite a few different design options that can help to contribute to a responsible design of AI systems in society. Bias essentially is about escaping that historical past dependency and enlarging our options beyond that cognitive memory that we learned and come to rely on. Therefore, one of the most important contradictions to bias is means of including diversity and inclusion in the developmental patterns of AI systems. And if we look at it from that way and enlarge the technical definition of bias with philosophical, the goal does not longer stay at eradicating bias, this reactive attitude, but actually it shifts to a more proactive discernment of biases likely to affect and materialize in the design of AI systems and finding out for ways to account for them or mitigation strategies, regulation strategies. One of the most helpful ways of how to attain that in the development of AI systems is by paying attention to the diversification of the design teams according to many different criteria, for instance, age, gender, occupation, ethnicity. Because the idea is that the more entry points and diverse entry points we have to identify and mitigate bias, the more resilient we can make these systems to mitigation and accountability of bias. And another strategy could be also to include not just the diversity of the design team, but also to include the final users in the design practices by, for instance, provocative design or adversarial design practices. And here below, I include a link for all of you who are interested to try to take a test of Harvard Implicit Association test that shows us how subconsciously bias seeps into all of our everyday practices and perceptions and how invisible it runs actually in our daily life. So coming back to our original question about bias and shifting perspective on it, is when we're considering bias in AI, is it only about eradication? I would argue that we cannot eradicate bias because it is constitutive to what it means to be human. But we can be proactive about spotting, mitigating, and accounting for it by means at least of diversity and inclusion in the design practices, by maintaining this continuous ethical mindset, how bias occurs at the intersection of different components of socio-technical system of AI, and by engaging users in the design practices as well. We cannot fix bias because it is a complex societal problem, but we also shouldn't focus only on technological ways of how to mitigate it. We need to consider it from the interaction of both the societal, technological, and cultural institutional engagement.